This is Conversations in Civics. I'm Dr. Terri Susan Fine. Joining me is Davidson Middle School American History teacher Grady Miller. But that's not the only hat he wears. Grady, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, Dr. Fine, I'm also the social studies subject area leader at my middle school, and I'm also a teaching fellow for the Florida Joint Center of Citizenship, as well as a national board certified teacher.
Wonderful. So you are well prepared to ask me lots of questions today. This conversation looks at the structure and function of our three branches of government as established in the U.S. Constitution. Today we're going to focus on the executive branch. Grady, what's your first question?
Dr. Fine, could you please tell me where in the Constitution the powers of the executive branch are given?
That's a great question to start with, Grady, because I'm going to shock everyone who's listening by telling you that it's not number one. Right, exactly. That it's Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution that actually identifies the powers of the executive branch. Now, the reason why people sort of tend to get confused is we often look at the president as the leader of the free world and the leader of the country. And so when I ask people, and my students especially, and I say, well, which is the most powerful branch of government? And they'll say, well, it's got to be the executive branch because the president is the most powerful person in the country and in the world. And I say, Article 1, it's the legislative branch. And in fact, by putting the president as number 2 to the legislative branch, that's a very symbolic gesture by the founding fathers that it was the president's responsibility to serve at the behest of Congress. So the fact that Article 2 comes after Article 1 is sort of speaking to what that relationship is supposed to look like.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Can you also tell me which entities make up the executive branch?
Oh, absolutely. If you go to Article 2 of the Constitution, what you'll find is that it says that the executive power shall be held with the president. And in fact, when we look at Article 2 and we look at our lives today, we realize that Article 2 is silent on things that are so important to us today, and let me explain. What we find is that the only actual offices mentioned in Article 2 are the president and the vice president. Okay? And in the U.S. Constitution, really, the vice president is only in power, sort of waiting for either there to be a tie in the Senate, right? Because the Senate is an even number of people because it's 2 senators per state, so any number times 2, of course, is an even number. And also, so if there's a tie in the Senate, the vice president breaks it, and that's, of course, very rare. And also, if the president dies while in office, then the vice president becomes president. And what that means is then we only hold elections every 4 years. We never hold a special election for president. The Congress never sort of decides who the president's going to be if the president dies or resigns or leaves office. So it's very important to sort of say, well, the vice president really, his or her only job, according to the Constitution, is to basically wait for there to be a tie in the Senate, or in the event that the president dies or resigns or leaves office, then the vice president becomes president of the United States, and thus the elections continue on that 4-year cycle, and that schedule doesn't change. However, I did mention that our lives today are very different than what we see in Article 2. And that's because of the fact that there's this entity called a cabinet, right? The president has a cabinet, and that cabinet is basically a set of officials who advise the president on key areas of their policy expertise. Now, as of today, there are 15 cabinet departments, but we started with 5, okay? And so you say, well, how would I ever know, when those first 5 were created? What if I get asked that on a test? Well, let me give you a little hint, Grady. If you pull out a dollar bill from your wallet, or even a 5, okay, and there's a seal on the front of that dollar bill, it's going to say Department of the Treasury, 1789. So we know that the first cabinet was created after the first president was inaugurated, that the president created his support system in the year that he became president. And that cabinet has grown ever since then. Now, the first 5 departments, one actually has gotten folded into the other, and I'll tell you about that in a sec. But the first 5 departments were the Department of State, which at the time was to help the president be the chief administrator, the chief executive. Now we see the Department of State as responsible for foreign policy, but that really wasn't its first sort of mission. So the Department of State, the Department of the Treasury, the Department of Justice, okay, and the Department of War and the Department of the Navy. Now, since that time, the Department of the Navy has gotten folded into the Department of War, and in the 20th century, the name of the Department of War was changed to the Department of Defense. And the heads of all but one of those departments is called a secretary, except the head of the Department of Justice is called the Attorney General. And you say, well, how did you go from 5 to 15? Well, that's because as different national priorities have emerged, consequently, we've seen that the president has created a department to deal with those issues. And I'm just going to give you a couple quick examples. After the end of the Vietnam conflict, which ended in 1975, what we found for the next 10 or 15 or so years were that there were a lot of casualties and a lot of folks who were stricken with a lot of health problems, say from Agent Orange, which was used. And so, consequently, the president created the Department of Veterans Affairs really to respond to the fact that we had so many living veterans from all of these conflicts, Korea, Vietnam, World War II, et cetera, who had all these lingering health issues and health concerns. And so that was a way to sort of centralize those issues. And then also after 9/11, the president created the Department of Homeland Security. So we see, as there are national issues, we see departments being created, either new departments or emerging from other departments. So for example, we used to have the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and now we have the Department of Health and Human Services and a separate Department of Education. I'm sorry, Grady, you looked at me because you knew I was wrong.
That's okay.
Actually, we have it's Health and Human Services and then a separate Department of Education.
Okay,
yeah.
That's a great answer. Now, what are some of the specific powers that are reserved to the executive branch?
Well, it depends on whom you ask, and it depends on who the president is at the time. We might remember when I started this conversation that we were talking about the idea that the president is supposed to serve Congress. But the president has certain powers that he can use to enhance his power profile, or he can use to sort of diminish it. And one of those is the power of the veto. And so the president can veto any legislation that he wants. And if the Congress fails to override, so that's an example of checks and balances. If the president fails to if the Congress fails to override, then that becomes law, okay? So consequently, the law might be to keep things as they are. If the Congress passes a new law and the president vetoes it, then the old law, which should have gone away, stays as that law. What we also find are these informal powers, and that's where those other departments might come in handy. You know, Grady, there's something that people call iron triangles. And iron triangles, some people say, are the informal policy apparati of government. An iron triangle is made up of a department secretary, congressional committees, and interest groups. Say, well, what do they have to do with policy making? And why is it? Well, we know triangle because I just mentioned 3 points. Iron, because iron is a very, very hard metal, okay? So that's really a very firm, strong place to make policy. The idea here is that the interest groups testify before Congress and ask them how to shape policy. Departments, secretaries of those departments, go before Congress and say, well, if you want us to enforce this law, you really need to put together a policy that has these provisions in it, and you appropriate this amount of money for us to do that. And Congress might say, no, we know better than you. We're the lawmakers. So what do we find? Well, who nominated that department secretary? The President of the United States. So we already know that by nominating those department secretaries, the President is already saying, I trust this person's judgment. So consequently, if the department secretary goes back to the president and says, I really want you to veto this legislation. I don't think that they're doing a good job with it. We need more money to make it happen. Then the president can use that veto pen in order to go ahead and, veto that legislation. So the iron triangle is sometimes called sort of the informal policy apparatus because it involves someone who is a trusted advisor to the president, and that would be the cabinet secretary.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned the presidential veto.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other powers that the executive branch has to check the other two?
There are other powers that the president has to check the other two. For example, the president, in a sort of a surreptitious way, he can use something called an executive order. Mm-hmm. Now, an executive order is the president saying how he will carry out his role as chief executive, meaning that he can say, this is how the executive branch is going to function on this issue. Well, how is that sort of making law? Because an executive order can only be undone either by another executive order or by a law being passed by the Congress, and if the president vetoes it, then it gets overridden. So let me give you an example from 1965. In 1964, President Johnson, over the objections of Republicans in Congress and many conservative Democrats in Congress, was successful in enacting the Civil Rights Act. A year later, he went to the Howard University in Washington, D.C. commencement address, and he introduced this idea that even though the Civil Rights Act promoted equal rights, no job discrimination based on race is one of the provisions, for example, he said you cannot take a man who has been hobbled by chains and remove those chains and expect him to then believe that he is equal. Okay? What he was really saying, Grady, was that I'm going to be using my power of an executive order to bring about something that we call affirmative action. So Executive Order 11246, okay? He wrote it, he signed it, and he said, any company that wants to do business with the federal government has to engage in affirmative action. So it's not just non-discrimination. It's also affirmatively recruiting those groups that have been discriminated against before the Civil Rights Act was passed. Now, you know that the federal government doesn't make guardrails on highways. It doesn't have construction crews that go out and build the interstates, right? Those are all private companies that are doing business with the federal government, and therefore it was his way of broadening the letter of the Civil Rights Act by bringing about affirmative action. And so that's a way that the president uses his power. You know, we've only got a couple minutes, and I just wanted to talk about just a couple more things, if that's okay.
Of course.
The other ways that the president does this is that the president has the power to nominate. The Senate has to confirm in order for those folks to get their jobs, and that would be cabinet secretaries, Supreme Court justices, ambassadors, other high-level public ministers. However, the Senate can't pick someone. The Senate can't nominate. The Senate can say no or yes, but they have to say no or yes to what the president has nominated. So if the president says, I would like this person to be the Supreme Court Chief Justice, they can say no, but they can't pick their own person. Maybe privately they might say, I've been talking to my friends, and if you nominate, Grady Miller, we'll say yes to Grady Miller. And certainly we've seen in history that the presidents have said no to chief justices. They've said no to justices. We've had justice nominees withdraw. We've had secretaries who weren't confirmed, and so forth. And same thing, that the president has to negotiate those treaties that the Senate has to ratify. The Senate can't negotiate the treaties that it eventually is going to ratify. Right. Grady, I could go on and on, but I'm so fascinated by this idea that from a political socialization perspective, we think of the president as the most powerful person, but we see from the Founding Fathers' perspective that he was really expected to be a servant to the public through Congress, that Congress was supposed to be the most powerful branch. We've been talking about the structure and function of our three branches of government as established in the U.S. Constitution, and we've been emphasizing our discussion on the executive branch. That's Conversations in Civics. I'm Dr. Terri Susan Fine.